Move to our next talk. I'd like to introduce Dr. Ajay Royyuru. Chris, do we have all of his talks loaded and is he available on Zoom? This was a slight last minute change. He was really ready to come here, and then due to COVID restrictions at IBM, he'll be joining us over Zoom, but we'll have him live. This is really a pleasure. I'll tell you, when we were putting the program together, it is clear that the future of surgeries that we will be doing will be an incorporation of not only big data, but of artificial intelligence. And how that is going to be used is really up to us, but we need really smart people to put together the technology to allow us to utilize it. And so about 2 years ago, I started cold calling IBM Watson when I knew we had to put this program together. And I was able to get a hold of Dr. Ajay Royyuru, who's the head of their health science division, and we've since become nice friends, and I'll tell you just a little about him. So he got his master's in education in biology and biophysics at the All India Institute in New Delhi, India, which for those of you that have been there know this is the MIT of India. He then did a PhD in molecular biology at the Tata Institute in Mumbai. He then came to my alma mater here in New York at Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center and did his postdoctorate. Since then, he spent over 20 years at IBM and has built a team of over 200 researchers, scientists, and healthcare professionals to build a team to help address the questions of artificial intelligence and how we can use data to enhance care of our patients. In 2016, he was named an IBM Fellow, and in 2021 was given their highest award, which is Distinguished Industrial Leader. Basically, in summary, he runs healthcare research for IBM Watson. And we saw yesterday in a nice talk from Dr. El-Saidi from UCSF on how we are already trying to use artificial intelligence in cases. And he's going to show us what the future is going to be and what current research is on the horizon. Thank you very much, Ajay. We'll play your video and then we'll take questions after.
Thank you, Dr. Maker, for the invitation to be with you today. And I'm honored to actually meet with this group of folks and to discuss with you advances in artificial intelligence technologies, and in particular its applications to surgery. Before I dive in, I want to tell you just a little bit more about what we do in IBM Research, and my research group that's focused on healthcare and life sciences research. IBM, as you all know, is a technology company, and our main thrusts of innovation and products are in the areas of cloud, particularly hybrid cloud, and AI, artificial intelligence. And into the future, we are also looking at technologies of quantum computing and making that available to our collaborators and clients at this stage. In the research division of IBM, we focus in two main aspects. One is the advancement of these technologies itself. And that is done by a variety of my colleagues across these areas of cloud, AI, and content, etc. In a second aspect in research division is actually the application of those technologies to the various industry sectors, like in the finance industry, travel and transportation, banking, etc. My own research team focuses on the advancement and application of these technologies to the healthcare and life sciences industry. We do that through the variety of research topics that I show at the bottom of the screen, bucketed primarily into three large strategic buckets. One is in computational biology, where we are looking at modeling and analysis methods to understand the mechanisms of disease. Second is in the area of computational health, where the data obtained from routine clinical visits, that's episodic as well as longitudinal information, gets modeled and analyzed through artificial intelligence to learn things like disease progressions and stages of disease and what to expect next. A third big bucket for us is digital health, where we are looking at data that can be collected and analyzed from events that occur outside the routine clinical visits, like the patient's own home and remote monitoring and so on. So these are some three research teams that we bring together to innovate and find new ways of addressing unmet needs in the healthcare life science industry. And then all of IBM research actually works with the businesses of IBM to bring these innovations to practice in the marketplace. So in particular, in the healthcare area, we work with our AI product teams, particularly focused in data and AI, with the Watson branded AI innovations that they bring to market. And with our colleagues in the Watson Health business unit, which is applying with their innovations specifically to the healthcare market. And they do that to address the needs of the market segment shown at the top, payer, provider, and government services, as well as life sciences. So that's really how the innovations we do in our research transitions through the businesses to reach the end users in those segments. And of course, in doing this, we have, in the research part of IBM, we have collaborated extensively with research partners and collaborators in the external community at academic medical research institutions in many of the segments that I show here to actually find ways in which to innovate and make that to better. So before I go into the specifics of the research we are doing, I also want to give you an idea of the landscape of data and digitization that is driving this transformation in the healthcare ecosystem. So there is going from the traditional forms of data to the digitized forms of data. That's the digitization trend. And the second is actually bringing new forms of analysis. First, the aggregation of data, and then the new forms of analysis, particularly with modeling and artificial intelligence to bear. So I'm not going to go through all the boxes you see here, but they all come together in a meaningful way. And the more pieces you bring together of technology, the more elements that you can lock and operate together with, the greater the transformation of the healthcare system. So that's the overall strategic direction we take. Before I go into details of the work we do in IBM, I want to give you an external view to this as well. In particular, I was drawn to this review article that you see on the top right, which is describing the role of AI in surgery. And it actually particularly calls out that surgeons are well positioned to integrate AI into modern practice. And that's very inspiring to us, and today I will be taking you through some examples of our own work in that way. I also want to draw your attention to a wonderful book by Dr. Predictive, titled Deep Medicine, where he reflects on the role of AI in the practice of medicine. We're not speaking specifically about surgery, we're talking about medicine overall. But he's talking, a point of view we drive is actually very important. He says AI is not just to reduce errors or improve workloads and efficiency of work, which may occur, but rather the role of AI is also to restore precious time on a practitioner to patient relationship, improve trust and the human touch, which is really what, which is actually about overall beginning to end understanding of where the patient is in the journey and how do you help them along the way. Right? So that's a bigger thing that we have to be able to achieve. And then lastly, at the bottom, you see, that this is an increasing trend of understanding how AI becomes relevant to medicine and AI becomes relevant to surgery. And you can see the uptake of augmented dimensions that are being incurred, which is wonderful that we are beginning of the transition that hopefully will achieve a significant impact on the practice. So the way I will take you through the content of our research is through this patient journey that I'm showing here of encounters that the patient is having, particularly describing signs and symptoms in their own environment before they come to the clinic. An outpatient visit where some assessment is performed and data is collected, and AI can try to improve the efficiency of that. An inpatient visit, in the case of the context of therapy, like you folks do, it is AI applied to a certain practice. And then an outpatient recovery and rehab and remote monitoring of the patient's performance. So I go through those steps in particular. Let me start with the outpatient. The example I'm choosing here is outpatient visit for mammography screening and mammography exam that is happening. And of course, this is currently practiced highly digitized form of imaging data that is very routinely obtained in radiology practices. So the role of AI in this case is to actually help improve the efficiency of this process and be able to assist the practicing radiologist in making these very tedious aspects of separating normal from abnormal. For example, if AI could assist the radiologist in more authoritatively screening out all the normals and giving the radiologist the time and attention to focus on what looks to be abnormal, that is not only a better use of their expert attention, but also causes possibly less fatigue, etc. So that's an example where AI is relevant. We have done this in retrospective setting where we take the data and we train a deep learning model to recognize what is the difference between normal versus malignant. And through the training of the deep learning system, we then are able to retrospectively assess, is that actually doing the job well? How well is it doing it compared to other state-of-the-art techniques? How well is it doing compared to radiology assessments performed by radiologists? And in which instances can we actually take away the burden of, for example, just reading a normal, right? And if we can do that, as well as removing all normals from the workflow, then the radiologist's attention is driven to do a much better, low fatigue task of examining what appears to be abnormal, and from there, reading out what is malignant. So the AI task of separating normal from malignant actually is being done pretty well by the method that I am showing you here. We published that recently, and that is a research result, right? That we are actually able to achieve fairly high sensitivity and specificity and a good AUC in the separation of normal and normal versus malignant. Now let's look at what it takes to bring that sort of research innovation to actual practice. I show up on top here the trajectory that innovation takes from research all the way to practice. Initially, of course, as you conceive of new methods of such innovation with AI, you actually have to go ask, is that even accurate? And you do that typically in a retrospective offline validation, as the result of the previous juncture. Once you gain enough understanding of that able, somewhere in the vicinity of what you think would be useful, you then go and seek regulatory approval for that. You do that through submission to the appropriate regulatory authorities. Here in the US, that would be a submission to FDA, essentially asking for approval to use software as a regulatory. And of course, the rigor of studies, trials, and validation has to be followed there. The result of that would be, if successful, an approval by the regulatory authority to practice that in a more system environment. That then becomes standard in practice, right? So I showed you a first step of the journey, and of course, you have to go through all the other steps before AI becomes routine in practice, or mammography as an example. Our team is also doing such radiology AI work in the area of chest X-rays, which of course is the most abundant form of imaging, and then also in dermatology and ophthalmology, where our team have done similar work. All of them are intended to follow a trajectory of research, some through the hands of our own business units, and some through the hands of other business partners that we get to collaborate. Right, but the trajectory remains more or less the same in achieving that. So that's an example of outpatient visit that we saw, and being able to do an assessment of the patient condition assisted by AI. Next, I'm going to take you into inpatient, in particular, surgical journey. And of course, the goal here would be to try and get to real-time data. What I'm going to show you right now is offline retrospective analysis that we'll be doing. But the goal would be to try and get to real time. So as many of you practice, and this particular example I will walk you through is actually for imaging in the instance of colorectal endoscopy to identify normal, abnormal, or normal cancer, and then use that information to assist the surgeon in marking the region and doing the resection, etc. So the first goal, of course, is the endoscopy data that you're getting. Then you use AI to actually do identification region by region of what appears to be normal or what appears to be cancer. So that's an example I'll walk you through, just to complete the overall picture of the surgical journey. Such AI assistance can also occur in real-time augmented reality-based tissue classification while you're performing the examination. And this is not limited to endoscopy. It can obviously and is also being experimented with in multimodal data fusion to be able to do this in real time. So multimodal data fusion assisted with AI can obviously give you a better understanding of what the patient disease condition is, segmentation, etc. And of course, the third aspect is in the biopsies and the digital technology that follows the surgical procedure. There too, AI becomes very relevant in being able to classify what you see under the microscope and achieve a better classification with AI. Today, I'm taking you into the endoscopy example itself, and this is work that we're doing together with collaborators who are practicing surgeons doing colorectal surgery. So I'm showing you actually the video images that are obtained in the process of surgery, and you folks will be very familiar with it, visible and near infrared imaging. And these are actually done together in conjunction with the use of a fluorescence dye that is marking tissues for perfusion. And what you see here is regions that the surgeon identified as regions of interest that they want to be able to classify. Is this tumor or is this not? And for each of those identified regions, with the data that we are tracking, is not just what the intensity of color of the pixels is, but actually from that, we're trying to obtain what is the perfusion that is occurring at each of those locations. So to do that, we're actually building a biophysical model of the perfusion or movement of fluid in the blood vessels and the perfusion of the dye through that. And that parameterized physical model is actually the parameters that are being fitted to the observed data. This allows us to actually get a better idea of physics plus statistical AI method in combination to learn the parameters of perfusion and use that to actually then classify the state of the region that I need to identify as that state being cancer or not. We do that region by region, and what I showed you here is for 20 such videos obtained from our retrospective video data sets. We are able to achieve a very high degree of accuracy, sensitivity, and specificity in doing this classification of the region, whether it's normal or cancer. This is a method that I'm describing to you how AI becomes relevant in doing the image classification. And mind you, this is accounting for the perfusion that is occurring. That's number one. The goal eventually would be to not just do it for an identified region, but actually to do it for the entire field of view. And it will become possible to do that, scaling that method, to do that as a next step to do the classification and segmentation for the entire field of view. So that's an example where AI plus physics-based modeling allows us to infer the disease condition. As I mentioned, this was done in an offline setting, but the next step will also be to try and bring this into real time. And the time it takes to actually train an AI model is significant, but to practice the AI model is very quick and it should become feasible to be able to do this in an intra-op setting down the road. Okay, so I talked to you about the intra-op. Now let me get to the recovery and outpatient assessment after the surgery has been performed. And as patient goes home, they have some acute conditions to be managed, and then they will be left with some chronic conditions that are relevant and have to be managed in a very long time setting. Here, what I will show you is what methods of data gathering and analysis become possible. And in particular, I'm looking at ambulatory monitoring of the patient, whether it's in rehab or in home. And patients are actually going and living their life as they normally would, right? They're not confined to doing scripted activity at that point. They're just doing normal unscripted activities in their routine life. What we do as technology is provide a few sensors that they can be putting on them. These might be things like a smart watch or a specific physiological patch that they put on themselves. And in the environment that they're in the room or in the house, a few devices like a camera that can be plain or visible, light camera or additional cameras that can do depth sensing, etc. But the signals that we get from those, when we are able to aggregate those signals, we can understand from that, understand the context moment by moment that the patient is experiencing, and then use that to infer metrics of mobility, pain, quality of life that we can then compare to the standard clinical measures. The standard clinical measurement might be, for example, for mobility, you bring the patient to the clinic and you do things like a time up and go, a functional reach test, etc. Or for cognitive, you have some other tests, or for the variety of tests that you are accustomed to doing to assess the patient in the clinic. The idea here is how much of those assessments can be performed at home from unscripted activity, and can you get those readouts continuously? And particularly for chronic conditions, where the patient actually is reading the day by day, those become very meaningful to measure and address. So let me show you a specific example of assessing chronic pain in the life of a patient. So here the patient actually is suffering from chronic pain, has undergone spinal cord stimulation, implanted device made by Boston Scientific that is implanted in the spine of the patient. And the patient is actually using that stimulation from the implant to manage their pain over days and months and years. Typically, the pain state is being reported, as you see on the left, in a self-reporting manner by the patient. And it is through a subjective reporting method, right? You are asking the patient, how severe is your pain on a scale of 1 to 10? And that has the bias of subjectivity and recall bias, etc. We are experimenting together with Boston Scientific in looking at such patients who are given devices to take home, so whether it's available, patch, sleep monitor, etc. And while they do their activities at home in an unscripted manner, can we infer the overall pain, the effective mobility, the sleep quality, moment by moment, or days on end, and in this case, months on end. So you see this continuous assessment actually becomes possible, and that actually is objective in nature, as in obtained through multiple quantitative signals, and we then need to correlate these not only to the patient's own reported pain score, but also to other measures, clinical measures, like you do bring the patient back to the clinic and you assess what the patient is experiencing or reporting at that moment in time in a clinical setting, and then you get to compare that to the last 20 days or the last 60 days or the last 90 days that they had at home, right? So you get an objective assessment of what they're experiencing at home, and you get to compare that to what's happening in the clinic. So in this manner, you get a digital readout and an AI-guided assessment of specific metrics like pain or quality of life or mobility, and help the patient achieve reduction in complications or improve the overall outcome of what the patient is expected to have after surgery in post-operative setting. So that's an example where applying these analytics with the right modalities of data collection becomes a way in which the patient then gains the benefit. Okay, so I'm going to bring us back to what this journey was and what can we conclude from it. So if you look at the aspect of data, they got digitized. Aspect of analysis, AI became assistance to. And what do we achieve from that is improved outcomes for the patient. That's the overall objective, and I'll show you specific examples where these become possible in the settings of the examples. And the last point I would like to leave you with is not just the practice that occurs or pre, intra, and post-op, but the overall patient journey in the longitudinal setting of how they experience their health and healthcare. So if you think of the entire longitudinal health record, we are also building AI techniques to do things like disease progression models to understand where the patient is in the progressive nature of this chronic progressive condition. And then stage the patient, be able to advise the patient what to expect next, or be able to recruit patients into specific clinical trials that are appropriate to that stage of the disease. So those are example ideas of disease progression modeling applied to longitudinal health records that our team is also doing, and I showed you here examples from type 1 diabetes, from Huntington's disease and Parkinson's disease as examples. With that, I conclude. I thank you for your attention and I can take any questions.
Wonderful. Do we have Dr. Royyuru on Zoom? Can you see us?
I see you, yes.
Great. Well, Ajay, I've been in the society for about 12 years and there's never been another Ajay. So that makes me very happy that this year we have two on the program. Ajay, we have an award that we'll ship to you. That if you can see it is to Ajay Royyuru 2021 State of the Art Lecture for the AHPBA. You're clearly much smarter than certainly myself and all of us in the room. And so we have some questions to help dumb it down for us so we can understand how to use this in our everyday lives. And I see Dr. Rebecca Minter, Chairman of Surgery, who has a question for you. Dr. Minter?
Just chair of surgery. We're working on our DEI here. So Dr. Royyuru, I really loved your talk and I love the vision that IBM Watson has put out. I wonder if you can help us think about implementation though, because all of these incredible predictive analytics really only work if we have discrete data in the EMR, and in the inpatient setting, we do have a lot of discrete data points coming from the ICU and other things, but really the predictive analytics in the ambulatory setting, so much of what's in there is free text, and it's just so challenging to get the data in a way that we can actually run the types of algorithms that smart people like you are helping us figure out. So can you help us talk about or think about how do we do this at the point of delivery so that we can actually bring what you're showing us to life in a broader, scalable way?
You're right, Dr. Winter. It's not adequate to digitize and leave the data digitized, but in silos. I think you're making the point that, yes, you get a point of data at the point of care and you do something with it, but then, you don't get to integrate that to understand what are the different aspects that the patient is experiencing and all the modalities of observation, how do you bring them together? So not just collect the data, but actually integrate the data is an additional technical challenge, integrated across the different points of care, different observations that occurred at the episodic visits that occurred. So that's actually an additional technical challenge. And you particularly made a point about information being left in clinical notes. So there's an area of artificial intelligence research called NLP, short for natural language processing. And that has actually advanced very significantly to actually be able to extract medical concepts out of clinical notes, not just literal mentions, but actually conceptually, semantically mapped mentions. That's a very advanced area of research. And the body of work that medical literature has accumulated, and including things like taxonomy and UMLS as an example, or medical concepts in general, they help. So at least in English language, it is possible for us to do very detailed annotation of clinical notes. It is possible to extract those, right? So we have digitization, access to the data, integration, and then things like annotation, like the annotation of NLP that I was describing. Those are sort of the steps that AI has to follow. And all that is still just leaving the data potentially useful. I think you still have to go to that next step, which is how do you push that to decisions that need to be made in the moment of practice? That's a big hill to climb. We don't climb that well today, not just IBM, but in general in the field. We don't climb that well today because hardly any of you as practitioners actually are using AI in the moment of practice, right? So that's the biggest hill that we have to eventually climb, but these are the steps we have to take to get there.
If I can just have one follow-up related to the natural language processing that you mentioned, and do you envision at IBM Watson that will be, a software, something that's laid on top of Epic, or are you working in partnership with Epic and Cerner and those groups to really build those algorithms in to the EMR to be able to pull that data out and build the algorithms that you're talking about?
Yeah, so in some instances, it is already layered in that way. So within IBM, we have a commercial offering called ACD, short for Annotation of Clinical Data, which is such a NLP as a service offering. And that gets layered on top of wherever the store of language-derived captured information is. So that can go on top of clinical notes, for example, or actually more often today it already goes on top of published literature. And some of you folks or the pharmacology folks will be familiar with IBM's offering called Micromedics, which is gathered information about drugs and toxicity, et cetera. So ACD basically becomes a annotation service on top.
Great. With I think that's Carl. Is it Carl?
Yeah.
Yeah, Carl Schmidt has a question.
Thank you for that really fascinating talk. I wondered if you have observed opportunities for the AI process to then teach us or educate. I think about your example of the reading of the AP chest radiographs being better than the third-year residents. And so then once you knew how the AI interprets the radiograph, does that provide a tool to do better teaching to the humans? Thank you again.
Dr. Smith, potentially yes, but I think AI is still in its infancy of understanding how to do even the basic tasks correctly. So I think a big goal for AI is to achieve explainability. Now that's something that when you go to medical school, achieve extremely well, right? It's not enough to actually have an intuition, but not be able to explain to your attending or to your patient on why this intuition needs to be followed. So AI is sort of in that infancy where it is doing feature gathering and analysis, and is, deep neural nets, for example, are doing extremely complicated fusion of elements or features to then allow making a decision. But if it can't explain which features, when in conjunction, actually constitute this sort of distinction between normal and abnormal, then nobody as a practitioner is going to say, well, I'm going to bet with that, right? Because if you can't even explain that. So explainability is one step that AI has to render always for it to be useful in practice. Second is, I think I'm giving you a personal view here, AI should never end up in a situation where it thinks it is doing something better than the expert practitioner, right? Because that is actually not achievable in my mind. Role of AI is to be an assistant. So if it can bring to your attention, the expert practitioner, things that you might have overlooked, elements of features that when put in conjunction actually constitute an extremely rare but significant outcome. Those sorts of insights will become much more useful in practice. So, take away the mundane that you know how to do, but AI can learn as well. Give you intuitive insights that are relevant to the outliers that you may not have paid attention to, but are significant in this case. So that is sort of the two extremes that AI can become your assistant for.
We clearly have more interest and we have time. We have time for one more brief question. Please introduce yourself.
Yeah, this is Onur Kutlu from University of Miami. Great talk. Thank you very much. It's all high level stuff above my average surgeon level intelligence. And all the questions were in fact like higher than what my knowledge was. However, I've been playing with this commercial version of Watson since 2016. The examples that I saw online, my question is going to be maybe lower fidelity than the others, were mostly based on business models. And many of us do here research using large data or databases or our own hospital databases. And we try to see or predict cancer outcomes using this Watson. Like loss of a customer was coded as the death of a patient, or survival was how long the person was a customer in the company for the Watson system to understand and give us meaningful some overview of what's going on with the landscape. And this, in fact, gave us a better understanding, a rapid testing of our hypothesis even before we started statistical analysis on what to focus on things. And this resulted in more than 10 papers in a year. So, however, do you guys have any plans for introducing a training or education program for large data analytics in healthcare and large database analysis that we do like on a daily basis, because I can't find any information online, any training modules, or any way to interact with Watson at a code level. So I can play with it a little bit to give it what I say. I have to code in Python to things to look at the data.
Yeah, you're absolutely right in pointing to some of the current commercial capabilities that are getting used in the field. With regard to training modules, there are capabilities on the core AI. By core AI, I mean not just specifically applied as a commercial offering to healthcare, but in general, like the natural language processing that I mentioned, or the explainability and fairness for diversity and inclusion and your clinical studies. We have toolkits in our AI tool chest that do those. And today, those are actually available for external use. So if you look at the Watson Studio or the Fairness 360, or, in the last chart, I was describing to you disease progression model, which is a capability that is coming out of our research, not in a product yet. But all these are capabilities that we are now beginning to open source or make available as toolkits. So disease progression modeling, the workbench, we call it DPM 360, is now open sourced and available and interoperates with OMOP and Odyssey. And you can use those to actually analyze data sets, like you mentioned, to do things like disease progression modeling. So those are sort of steps we are taking to make these research tools visible and available to a community like yours.
Well, thank you so very much, Dr. Royyuru. We greatly appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you for the opportunity, and my apologies for not being able to be there in person.